Hey guys, I'm Roger Walker and today we are going to look into Ableton Live's operator. So before I could start talking about operators in Ableton Live, I would like to touch bases with some basics. So FM synthesis or frequency modulation or change in frequency. So this is controlled using an LFO, and this LFO controls the frequency of an oscillator to make changes in pitch. So the higher the rate of the LFO, the higher the change in timbre. So FM synthesis is used to achieve a change in timbre over time to make it interesting. So in a subtractive synth, we usually start with a rich harmonic wave and subtract it by running them through different filters. But in FM synthesis, we start with simple waveforms like a sine wave or a saw wave, and we modulate its frequencies to make change in timbre. An operator has an oscillator, an envelope, and its dedicated amplifier, whereas an oscillator in subtractive synth are very simple oscillators which are used to generate a sine wave or a saw wave, has a shared envelope and a shared amplifier. So whereas an operator is almost like a mini synthesizer where the oscillator has its own envelope and a dedicated amplifier, so we could make changes independently. So now coming into Ableton Live's operator, we can see there are 4 different operators, A, B, C and D, and we use different algorithms to perform FM synthesis. So these different operators are interconnected with each other, so not all are audible at the same time, and mostly we use them as modulators to make changes. So now let's get into the interface of the operator. The box in the middle is display, and everything on the left and right are called shelves. Shelves gives you a very simplified high-level parameters to change all different level modules. The display changes according to which module you select, so the display is contextual. So the layout are 4 operators on the left, A, B, C, D from bottom to top, and on the right we have the LFO, the filter section, the pitch envelope, a general global section down there. So now looking into the operator, it can be toggled on and off independently by just clicking on A, B, C, D. So the shelf parameters for operator A is coarse. So coarse is tuning that sets the parameter for the octave, which is basically the integer multiplier of the fundamental frequency. Whereas fine is a fine tune knob, which is an inharmonic multiplier, so we get a smooth pitch change. Fixed allows you to disconnect the oscillator from the keyboard, produces a constant pitch regardless of what you're playing. And multi, we get a frequency control and a multiplier of that specific frequency to set a particular frequency that we want. And the level finally is an individual amplifier in the operator, so each could be set differently independently. So now let's get into the display section of the operator. So the display section is divided into 3 parts. One is the mini display, one is the envelope section, and one oscillator section. So you can toggle between the envelope and the oscillator by just clicking on it. Going further into the oscillator section, there's an option where you can select the wave. Here you can choose whether you want sine wave, saw wave, square wave, triangle wave, or user, which is a custom wave. I usually go with the sine wave 99% of almost every time, because in FM synthesis it definitely gives better results. So looking into sine wave, when you add more bars, what happens? Your sound changes. And one thing we need to note is the further higher we go in the wave, the lesser the volume. So every waveform or sound can be approximated by a series of different sine waves that gets added together to create a rich sound. And every vertical bar represents a different sine wave at different frequency, which is a multiplier of the base frequency or the fundamental frequency. So adding bars in the sine wave makes it higher in pitch but lower in volume, and definitely changes the timbre. On the right side, we get to choose how many bars we want to use, either 16, 32 or 64. 16 bars is usually bigger granularity, and 32, which gives you more harmonics in the wave, and 64, you can just end up drawing crazy curves. So shortcuts to remember in this: one specific bar. If you want to work on one specific bar, it's really difficult, but then when you hold down shift, your option just stays on that one bar, no matter you move left or right, regardlessly. Yeah. And there's another shortcut where you look at the status bar, especially when you're working on one single frequency, that is one bar. You get to see what frequency it is and how much dB it is. So you can get a very narrowed down result. Another cool feature is when you right click the operator display, you can choose whether you want to use even or odd. And when you choose even, you get to draw only the even bars. And when you choose odd, you get to draw only the odd bars. And one last thing, if you made a really cool sounding synth with a fancy curve, which is close to impossible to do it again, all you need to do is right click and export the AMS file, which gets stored in your user library for further use. So now coming down to the other options in the oscillator, one is repeat. Repeat actually repeats the harmonic over and over again in a diminishing value. It allows you to determine how much of the harmonics you'll be adding before it starts fading out. The higher you go, the more the attenuation in the harmonics, so it leaves you just with the fundamental frequency. Now coming to feedback, this is actually how much the operator modulates itself than modulating another oscillator. It's available only for the operator that doesn't have a corresponding modulator. That means feedback gets activated only on operator D for now, because it has a corresponding modulator, which is C, operator C. So the next option we get to see in the oscillator is phase. Phase is a waveform offset button. So usually what happens when you get to draw such fancy curves, you can also see that your waveform has been changed over here. And you could get to choose where your wave actually starts from while you're playing the synth. The retrigger button, the R button over here, is a retrigger, which actually retriggers the phase every single time you press a key on the keyboard instead of starting from the start. Oscillator to velocity is a very unique parameter seen in Ableton Live's operator. It assigns a pitch to the oscillator to the velocity of the key. So the more the harder you press the key, the more the velocity actually alters the pitch of the synth. And Q button quantizes it to the coarse knob, where as of the velocity is controlling the knob. The higher we play, the higher it jumps in octaves. For example, when we jump octaves in coarse, so when you hit Q and when your velocity is selected, it changes the pitch of the synth automatically according to the velocity of the key being pressed. So we covered the oscillator part of it. Now let's move on to the envelope part. So an envelope is assigned to every single operator, and you can even change the values of the envelope by dragging the dots, but it's better changing it here because you have more control over the movements. So you have attack, you have decay, you have release, sustain, you have the peak value and the initial value. So the initial value moves your first dot of where your wave starts, then the attack and the decay, the peak value and the sustain and the release. So that's done. Now let's go on to the time and velocity. This is a really cool feature where you assign the time of an envelope to the velocity of the keyboard. So when the velocity is assigned, the overall level of the envelope using a velocity key. And the key is you get to choose the range of the keyboard that you're going to use. So it can be negative as well, bringing it back to 0. So Coming down to loop, if you click on loop, there's a drop down with none, loop, beat, sync, and trigger. So none is no loop. It's usually a standard ADSR generator. But when you choose loop, it behaves almost like an LFO. Basically starts looping. So when you choose beat, this option syncs it with the tempo of your DAW. My DAW is set to 120 BPM now. So probably the ADSR gets synced to the DAW's tempo. And when I choose sync, which is not too different from beat, sync actually syncs it to one single point. It's either the start or the end. And the last option is trigger. It's just a single cycle loop. So your cycle starts and ends. That's trigger. So no matter how long you press your key, your entire cycle plays and then it goes off. So like I said, the operators are identical, A, B, C, and D, with all individual parameters to be set. You can toggle them on and off individually according to your requirement. Sometimes you use 2 operators together, sometimes you use all 4 operators together, depending on your sound. To do a simple FM modulation, depending on which algorithm you've set, now if you look here, operator D is modulating operator C is modulating operator B, and operator B is modulating operator A. That's because of this algorithm. Now, let me toggle operator C and D off, and coming to B. So as I said, operator B is modulating operator A. So when I choose a different course in operator B, you could see operator B modulating operator A sound, which is the fundamental sound that's coming out. So the 2 components actually creates a timbre change. It's because of the ratio between the modulator and the carrier, or basically the audible oscillator. So change in course gives you a change in timbre. So in FM synthesis, modulators are one oscillator working on another oscillator. The change in frequency and level will not result in change in frequency or level, but will only change its timbre. To change the timbre in FM synthesis is to change the properties of a modulator. So the shortcut here is right-click an oscillator to copy its settings from one oscillator to another. So you basically have set the ADSR, you right click it, and you get to copy it from A, copy it from oscillator C, copy it from D, or you copy the envelope from oscillator A and different other options. So you get to choose whether you want to copy the same oscillator settings on another oscillator. So now that we are done with the operator section, we move into the right shelf, where the first option is LFO. You can toggle LFO on and off by just hitting the blue button right next to the name. The first drop down is where you get to choose what kind of wave are you going to use, either a sine, a square, or a triangle wave. And the different parameters that are available in this module is the rate and the amount. Rate is basically setting at what frequency your LFO is working, and amount is basically how much your LFO is being added. So the drop down right next to the wave selector is low, high, and sync. So low basically makes your LFO work however it's working, and high produces really high frequencies to modulate different parameters, and sync turns it to a beat maker and syncs it to your DAW. Here you'll find a reset button. So when this reset button is hit, your LFO gets reset whenever you hit a key. Now let's get into the display section of the LFO. We have 2 destinations, destination A and destination B. So destination A is a combination of the operator frequency as well as the cutoff frequency of the filter. And destination B, you get to choose from oscillator parameters, filter parameters, and global parameters. Here, you get to choose your rate to key. Rate to key is basically setting the rate of the LFO to the keyboard. And you get to choose amount of velocity, where you get to select the rate of the LFO to the velocity property of what the key is being played. Now on the left, we get to see the envelope section. This envelope section is also much similar like the operator's envelope, but the only difference is here you have an end value, which is just there for the LFO. So now that we're done with the LFO section, let's toggle it off and move on to the filter section. So the filter, the first option, the drop down, you get to choose your filter type, whether a low cut, high cut, or a band pass. And then 12 and 24 is the type of the slope that you're going to select. The next drop down says clean, OSR, MS2, SMP, and PRT, which is basically clean is an EQ8. OSR, MS2, and so on are basically simulations from different synths. In this, you get to set the frequency through a knob and the resonance through a knob. Now moving on to the display, you get to see three sections: the mini display, the envelope section, and the filter section. So when you get to see the envelope section on the left, it's similar to all the other things I explained. So moving on to the filter section, you could adjust the filter by just dragging the dot around, or moving the filter, frequency knob, and the resonance knob. So coming here, you see shaper, whether you want the filter to be soft, hard, or go on a sine wave, or a 48-bit filter. Another option that gets activated when you choose one of the simulations is the filter drive. So filter drive basically gives more character and edge to the filter. And then you have your frequency to velocity according to your key. And then you have frequency to key according to which key is being pressed, your shape drive, and your dry and wet that you can mix. So moving on to the next parameter, which is the pitch envelope. The pitch envelope has a dedicated ADSR, which is used to control the pitch oscillator. So the pitch envelope has a plus and minus knob to contribute to it. And then it has spread. Spread is basically a chorus effect stacking two voices and panning them left and right. Sets the detune to a richer sound. And then you have transpose. Transpose is basically the overall transposition of the semitones of the synth. So moving into the display of the pitch envelope, you have envelope on the left and aux control on the right. So envelope is similar to the others. So moving on to the aux, you have destination A and destination B. Destination A basically allows you to control the frequency of any oscillator and also control the frequency of the LFO itself. So you get to choose the LFO and you get to choose how many percent it is. Then you have destination B, which is almost the same parameters, where you get to control the oscillators, filters, or the general global options. You can use it as a spare envelope generation if we wanted to. Glide is the amount of time to slide between notes, where you can even choose how many milliseconds. So the next we move on to our final section, which is the global section. On global section, on the left you find the algorithm, and then you have time, which allows you to time stretch every envelope. And then you have tone. It's basically a low pass filter used to avoid aliasing. Due to being a digital synth, we can end up aliasing with things out of the band. So this knob actually helps us. And the volume knob controls the overall volume. Moving into the display, on the top you can find different algorithms basically. So you get to choose one single algorithm according to your choice. So the algorithms work in such a way where it is color coded: orange, blue, green, and yellow, which is basically operator 4, 3, 2, and 1. So looking at this algorithm is operator D is modulating operator C is modulating operator B, and operator B is modulating operator A. Likewise, you have other algorithms which two or more operators act as modulators on an operator. So the carrier signal and the modulator, this is something we need to understand. The carrier is the operator that we can actually hear, and the modulator is an operator used to control the frequencies of a carrier or another operator. Each box represents an operator. Signal flows from the top to the bottom. Likewise, on the extreme right, we find an additive synth where all the operators don't work as modulators and they all work independently. So now looking at the middle section, you have different parameters to assign, basically MIDI parameters, which are velocity, key, aftertouch, pitch bend, and mod wheel. Like all the other shelf parameters on the right, there are destination A's and destination B's. And on the bottom, you get to choose voices, whether you want to use 1 or you can go up to 20, which is basically 1 means monosynth and it goes up to a polysynth. The max number of voices you can go is 20. So retrigger is something that when a note is playing, it will not play the note again unless it's done. So we don't have to use many voices. The next option is interpolation. Interpolation just helps us to have smoother waveforms. Anti-aliasing smoothens the overall sound. And pan is used to pan it either left or right on the overall. And then you have pan to key and pan to value. One last thing that I'd like to say is the triangle button over here, which helps you save a lot of space while you are loaded up with a lot of audio effects. Anyways, I hope you guys learned a lot. See you all soon. Thanks.